On January 27, 1945, when the Allied forces entered the Auschwitz camps, they were confronted with a scene of unimaginable horror. What they discovered was a mass extermination operation like nothing the world had ever seen. The tragic events of Auschwitz became one of the most horrifying chapters in human history. The origins of Auschwitz trace back to the early years of World War II. When Nazi Germany invaded Poland in 1939, they began building concentration camps. The SS Schutzstaffel, a paramilitary organization under Adolf Hitler's control, converted Auschwitz into a prisoner of war camp. This initial camp was only the beginning of the atrocities that would follow. Soon, the Nazis started constructing Auschwitz II, known as Birkenau, which would become the center of the worst crimes. Of the 1.3 million people sent to Auschwitz, about 1.1 million perished, and their remains were desecrated. This shocking number was only the beginning of the horror that the survivors would later reveal. The truth about the horrors of Auschwitz came out in bits and pieces through the testimonies of those who survived the camp, and these accounts would leave the world forever changed. Adolf Hitler's rise to power as Chancellor of Germany in 1933 marked the beginning of a policy of mass extermination that would soon come to be known as the final solution. This genocidal ideology was supported by various right-wing extremists before Hitler, and it became central to Nazi beliefs. The aim was to eliminate Jews and other groups considered undesirable. Before the invasion of Poland, Germany already had multiple concentration camps, though these were used primarily for detaining Jews, political prisoners, and others opposed to the Nazi regime. These early camps were just a precursor to what Auschwitz would become. As the Nazis invaded Poland, they set up concentration camps within the country's army barracks. One of the prominent figures overseeing the establishment of the camps was Rudolf Höss, who served as the first commandant of Auschwitz. The location of Auschwitz was likely chosen because it was situated at a major railway junction, which made it easier to transport large numbers of prisoners. In the early stages, the camp was equipped with a crematorium to burn the bodies of those who had been executed or died. However, by 1942, the Nazis expanded the crematorium to include 3 ovens capable of burning 340 bodies per day, and these facilities soon began to be used to murder those who were still alive. The Nazis continued to build these gas chambers, ultimately constructing 5 of them. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, visited the camp in March 1941 and ordered the camp's expansion to accommodate more prisoners. This led to the creation of Auschwitz II, or Birkenau, which was completed in October 1941. Auschwitz could hold about 15,000 prisoners, while Birkenau could hold over 90,000. This massive expansion revealed the scale of the Nazi extermination machine and its increasing brutality. The prisoners sent to Auschwitz were mostly Jews, approximately 1.1 million of the 1.3 million total. The rest were made up of non-Jewish Poles, Roma, Gypsies, Soviet prisoners of war, homosexuals, and those deemed physically or mentally unfit by the Nazis. The suffering and death that occurred at Auschwitz were unparalleled in human history, and the scale of the cruelty remains incomprehensible. When the Soviet Red Army reached Auschwitz, they discovered a huge pile of shoes left behind by the victims, a haunting symbol of the atrocities committed at the camp. This image, though powerful, was just one example of the brutal treatment the Nazis imposed on their victims. Upon arriving at Auschwitz, prisoners were often crammed into cattle wagons under horrendous conditions. The prisoners' suffering did not end upon arrival. It only worsened. They were given triangular patches sewn onto their jackets to identify them by prisoner number. By July 1942, the majority of those sent to Auschwitz were Jews. The Nazi doctors would examine the prisoners and, if they were deemed unfit for work, they were immediately sent to the showers. These showers were actually gas chambers designed to kill those deemed unworthy of labor. This method was used to eliminate not only the elderly and sick, but also children and pregnant women. Once inside the gas chambers, the prisoners were exposed to Zyklon B, a deadly poison gas. Tragically, many of the victims were never even recorded in the Nazi databases, making it impossible to determine the true scale of the atrocities committed against the weakest members of the population. The prisoners were also segregated by various categories, with different colored badges sewn into their clothing. Political prisoners wore red triangles, while criminals from Germany wore green. Roma, prostitutes, and homosexuals wore black triangles, while Jews wore yellow Stars of David. The nationality of each prisoner was indicated by a letter stitched onto their clothing. This system of identification created a racial hierarchy, with German prisoners at the top, followed by non-Jewish prisoners and Jews at the bottom. For those who survived the initial gas chambers, life at Auschwitz was little better. Prisoners were forced into a life of forced labor, where many died from exhaustion, disease, and malnutrition. The daily routine was brutal and exhausting. The day for the male prisoners began at 4:30 a.m., while women had to wake up even earlier. A gong would ring to signal the start of the workday, and the block supervisors would go around beating the prisoners with sticks, forcing them to use the latrines quickly. The sanitary conditions were appalling, leading to widespread illness and infection. Breakfast was a small ration of coffee substitute, just enough to keep the prisoners working. Later, the prisoners would line up in rows to be counted. If any prisoner was missing, the others were forced to stand outside for hours until the missing person was found. This was followed by a grueling workday with no rest periods. Lunch consisted of a watery soup, often described as disgusting and unsanitary. The evening meal was a small amount of stale, moldy bread. At night, prisoners had to endure a second roll call, where punishments like flogging and hanging were common. If a prisoner was missing, the others were made to stand until the missing individual was found. Jewish prisoners were not allowed to receive any mail, so they were kept completely isolated from any news from the outside world. Thousands of prisoners were crammed into overcrowded barracks. Once the curfew was sounded, the camp would fall silent, with only one person still awake, the notorious Dr. Joseph Mengele. Known as the Angel of Death, Mengele conducted horrific medical experiments on prisoners, including babies as young as a few months old. His inhumane experiments prolonged the suffering of thousands of people. By 1945, when the Soviet army entered Auschwitz, they found about 7,800 sick prisoners, while 60,000 others had been sent on a death march, many of whom perished along the way. More than 1 million people lost their lives in Auschwitz, and the world must never forget the pain and sacrifice of those who endured this unimaginable horror. This chapter of history must be remembered, for only by acknowledging it can we ensure that such a tragedy never happens again.